welcome to Not So PG. I'm Brooke Blurton. My pronouns are she and her.
I'm Matty Mills. My pronouns are he and him. And before we get started, we'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the land on which we record. And for me and Brooke, it's the Gadigal People of the Eora Nation, because guess who is in studio?
Me.
Miss Brooke Blurton.
Right
here. You're a little bit further away than we were last time. Do you remember when you were in studio last time and I was right there?
I know.
It was like in this really intimate moment.
Because I haven't sprayed deodorant. That's why you're sitting on the other side of the room.
There's a line in the play that was my favourite line, and it was, and put some deodorant on and use that chemical deodorant, not that natural shit. Doesn't work. Not for you.
Amen. I've tried it. It doesn't work.
It doesn't.
Nah,
I know.
yeah.
But it is good for the environment.
But it does. And you kind of get that creamy, crusty flakes and you just don't want them.
Oh, no, that's nasty.
Anyway, should we get into it?
Yeah, let's get into it. So how was your weekend? You spent some time with the girls?
Yeah, I was working this weekend.
The young First Nations girls. How are they going?
They're going good. It's last term, so they're kind of feeling it. The mood is a bit, stagnant, I guess. But we're trying to do activities with them to get them out and about. You know, they explore Melbourne. And it's good because I haven't even explored Melbourne. I didn't even know how to catch a tram.
Don't. Oh, my life.
I was supposed to take them on the tram the other week.
Do you have a My Key card?
Yeah, so we had all my keys and I cracked it and was like, you know what? I'm driving.
Oh, don't. So you took them in the car, in the chimney?
No, I took them in the bus. I drive the bus. I know. I'm living out my footy dreams because I took them to the footy on Saturday, the AFLW game. And then on Sunday, I took them to the movies.
Yeah.
And then on Saturday, I was like driving the bus. I was like, this is my calling.
Do you know how great these memories are going to be for these girls? Because I know, because I went to boarding school, right?
Yeah.
And I was the only black fella there. And whenever I had an older person who would, sometimes they would have been an old boy from the school or like just an older, cooler person take us out on like a trip, we used to go to Costco on like the weekends, and that was like the highlight of my weekend.
See?
Going to Costco with like some like old boy who was like looking after us for the weekend at the boarding house. Like these memories you're making with them are going to be like lifelong. They're going to be like, do you remember that time we went with Brooke to the football?
Oh my God, I love it. They're so good. Liv, who also volunteers, actually plays for St Kilda, the women's team.
Oh, nice.
And, she gave them the boots off her feet that she played in that day. I know that sounds a bit like odd. But
no, that's so beautiful.
She was like, no, if you want my boots, I'll give them to you. And she just gave them off her feet. I was like, that's dedication.
What sort of boots were they? Do you know what brand? Maybe she can get sponsored for some new ones.
I think she is sponsored, so that's why. Yeah, exactly. You would hope so, being AFLW.
It's like when your family come over to your house and you get the PR packages and you just give them all away. So I give all my PR packages away. Like,
I do as well.
Seriously.
I take them into the girls. All the girls are like wearing my clothes that I've taken them in. Honestly, God, I'm like,
so
those
nice.
jeans look nice.
I love that. And you know what? It's perfect because they probably fit your clothes too.
They're the same size as me, girl.
Yeah. And they're girl. Yeah, she's here. You know what? Someone called me yesterday, my brother on the phone. He goes, I was FaceTiming my niece and nephew, and he goes, speak to Auntie Maddie. Like, he knows that just riles me up because when I was little, he used to fucking piss me off by I'm not farting, that's the chair. He used to piss me off by calling me a girl because I was feminine. And he would call me a girl and I would call him nasty names as well.
Oh my God, that
boys.
is making me think about we should unpack gender. Because you know why? I've been having a lot of conversations about that. Like just the frustration. Like even when I was younger, I used to get my hair shaved because I had school sores or like nits.
Nits, yeah.
Oh my God, this
Did
is
you
going to be a
call
long
them
story.
munies?
But like, no, you said this last time.
Yeah, munies.
But I used to get referred to as a he.
Yeah.
And they'd be like, oh, you're a cute little boy, aren't you? And I'm like, because I was obviously like, I look more feminine in a way, but then I had shaved heads.
Why have our lives been so similar? Because as you say that, I remember my mum telling me that when I was little, I had locks like my dad. So I had long, curly, really curly ringlet hair down to my shoulders. I would have killed
for that.
And I was getting on the bus and the bus lady said to my mum, oh, she's a pretty little girl. And I don't remember it, but my mum told me that. And I think that like was ingrained in my head because I was also feminine, like, sort of feminine gay boy, and my brother would call me a girl. So anyway, that was like a funny thing. He said yesterday just to rile me up. But
Yeah.
How did we get to the gender conversation?
Well, let's go back a few steps because I obviously,
Yes.
So I worked this weekend with the girls and then you're talking about, you know, how these memories, you know, you remember some of the memories that you would do with your teachers.
Yeah.
And that's all what it's all about is actually just creating memories. And I love that part of my job. Like that is literally getting paid to hang out and take kids to movies. Like that is just weird.
It's so cool.
It's so strange.
Because it's like
but
you're getting like it's actually a symbiotic relationship. Like as much as they're getting something from you, you're getting something from them. It's like healing your inner child.
It really is.
You know?
It really is. But we had a really good day. We went and watched Ninja Turtles. Mm-hmm. Pretty good.
Yep.
And then afterwards we're walking back to the bus and I had to have some difficult conversations with the girls.
Yes.
So when we're heading back, the protests were happening, obviously, for Palestine, Israel, what's happening in Gaza.
Yep.
And it opened, and I'm really, you know, okay with having conversations. I hope having conversations about the referendum, having conversations about gender. The girls are really open and they're actually really inquisitive. And I love that about them because I was, and probably both of us.
You remember that age, right?
Yeah.
Where just everything is a question.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you know what? Ask why 5 times and you'll get the truth.
Yeah.
So I'm like, oh my God, okay, here we go. This is a deep conversation to have with 13-year-old girls, right? They're quite young, but they were so, you know, it just left like such an impression on me because it's like they're so empathetic.
Yeah.
And they have no idea, obviously, what's happening over there. And to
a lot
me,
of young people don't.
Exactly. And it was really difficult to explain in such a short period of time. Because there's so much, right? There's so much. And I thought, okay, how can this be an opportunity to talk about something that's really heavy and that's happening in another country?
Yeah.
But the thing that the girls brought up was something really interesting, right? Some protest flags had the Aboriginal flag.
Yeah.
And some of them had, you know, written genocide.
Yeah.
And, you know, have this and you know, the girls were all reading, they're like, why is there so many Aboriginal flags and why is there so many words of genocide? And me explaining genocide to them after they've had a really positive day is it takes a little bit of a turn on the bus home.
Yes.
But I think it was really important. I think these are the moments you need to unpack them. If they're asking the question, you have to kind of have the information ready for them to absorb in that time because they're ready for it.
And even if you don't know, for instance, I'm on a bit of like a information seeking journey for what's happening. Like I feel like I don't know enough, and I think that like it's been really important for me to do the research and see what's out there and be really really curious and observant. And I understand with this conflict, there is a lot of solidarity for the First Nations community with what's happening in Gaza and to the Palestinian people. And I think that's why today's episode is really important for us.
Yes.
Because we are both trying to gather information and understand this conflict a little bit more. And that's why it's so important to get someone who is well briefed and has done the work on this. So, we're really excited to be able to chat with a special guest and, they're coming up very soon. Okay, so we have Antony Lowenstein, an Australian Jewish journalist and author, with us here on Not So PG. B and I, along with the rest of the world, have been extremely shocked and saddened with what is happening with Israel and Palestine conflict. And the sad reality is that we're seeing on social media that so many lives, hundreds of thousands of civilians are affected by this, but so many lives have been lost on both sides. We as First Nations people see a lot of solidarity with Palestine from our channels and platforms, but we want to dig deeper and we want to know, we want to go back and we want to understand why this is happening. So we thank you firstly for your time and thank you for being on here with Brooke and I.
Thanks so much for having me.
So in your opinion, Antony, why is this happening in 2023? It's absolutely shocking to see.
There's a short answer and a long answer. Let me give you briefly the short answer. On October 7, as many listeners will be aware, there was a really shocking, outrageous, illegal, brutal attack by Hamas, which is a Palestinian organisation running out of Gaza in the Middle East, on Israel. There were roughly 1,400 Israelis killed, many of whom were civilians, women, children, men. Some soldiers were killed as well, but it was a lot of civilians. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen some of those images. It was brutal. A lot of it was not aired on TV. Some of it's on social media, Instagram, TikTok, etc. And the response by Israel to that immediately afterwards was to start bombing the Gaza Strip. Now, just for listeners who aren't aware, we're talking about an area which is Israel and Palestine is essentially half the size of Tasmania. It's very, very small. And the Israeli communities and the Palestinian communities, as in Israel and Gaza, are literally next to each other. So when people talk about Gaza and Israel, yes, they're separate, but in fact, they're literally down the road. Mm-hmm. And that gives you a bit of a sense, I think, for a lot of people that often we think about conflicts as in across continents, or, people think of World War II, across Europe and the Middle East. This is in a remarkably short amount of space. So yes, there was a brutal attack. Israel has responded, but of course there's also context, which we can get to. But that was the initial, explosion around 3 weeks ago, which has led to this catastrophe that we're in now.
Mm-hmm. It's absolutely devastating to see, and I think one of the most shocking things is seeing the amount of children whose lives have been taken by this conflict. You lived and worked on the ground for years. Can you tell us about that experience and why it was so important for you to tell the story of what was happening?
So I'm a Jewish German Australian, but I call myself an atheist Jew. Mm-hmm. And if people wonder what the hell that means, essentially that means I am culturally Jewish, but not religious in any way. Mm-hmm. So practically speaking, I know a lot of people these days who call themselves atheist Muslims, atheist Christians. Some people find that a weird contradiction, but I think it's quite common in the West now. Mm. And I grew up in a pretty traditional Jewish home in Melbourne. I live in Sydney now, but I grew up in Melbourne. And Israel was never the centre of our lives. But a lot of listeners, and maybe including you guys, know, and I'm generalising here, but for many Jewish people, Israel is a big part of their life. Mm-hmm. They grew up with supporting Israel. They believe that Israel should exist, that it should be secure, that it's vital that Israel is a Jewish state. I grew up with all those, I would call them mostly myths. Most of my family were killed in the Holocaust. In Europe, the ones who got out in 1939 escaped wherever they were allowed in, Australia, Canada, US, UK. And the fast forward to the last 2 decades, I always felt when I was growing up that this knee-jerk blind support for Israel and what I often heard racism towards Arabs and Palestinians was really wrong. It was maybe uncomfortable when I didn't have the language to understand it when I was 10 or 12 or 13 probably. But as I got older, I started feeling like there was a concerted campaign by many in the Jewish community and Jewish leadership, both in Australia and elsewhere, to not just silence Palestinian voices, but to delegitimize their right to any kind of equality in Palestine itself. And the impact of that was that I started writing about this about 20 years ago. I first visited Israel, Palestine in 2005. I was writing my first book, which came out in 2006, called My Israel Question, which I look back in hindsight was a pretty mild book. I mean, the response was explosive. It became this massive bestseller, and many in the Jewish community were calling it to be banned. I mean, there was pressure on my publisher to pulp the book. It was just nuts, condemned in Parliament. If you look at what I was saying now, believe me, it was very uncontroversial, I thought. But essentially, I started going there 20 years ago or so, and I've been visiting every 3 or 4 years since. And in 2016 to 2020, I was living there with my partner. She worked for an NGO, and I was there as a freelance journalist in East Jerusalem. And essentially, although a lot of my work is not about me, it's not about me as a Jewish Australian, I do feel like it's important that there is a understanding that there are Jewish voices that do not support what Israel is doing. Doesn't by any means support what Hamas did on October 7, not at all. Have condemned it 110% and continue to do so. But there is a context for what Israel and many in the Jewish community have supported for decades is an ugly, brutal occupation of Palestinian territory, which is why in the last 3 weeks you have seen this explosion of global protest and support for Palestine, including here in Australia, US, UK, Europe. Of course, protests for Israel as well, to be sure, but huge protests. And I think partly why you see a lot of First Nations people here and in New Zealand, in fact. I mean, I'm obviously not a First Nations person myself, but I was in New Zealand recently on a book tour before this all happened. And I was amazed with the amount, and I'm generalising, but how much Maori support there was for the issue of Palestine, understanding the connections, differences, but connections between what happened to their people there and to what's happening today in Palestine.
Yeah, well, that's what I think the girls that I was with yesterday were bringing up, the word genocide and kind of, curious to know what genocide is and having to explain, to 13-year-old girls what's happening in the world. And one of the questions that they put, forth to me or, said, why did they bomb them? Like, why are they doing this as a first, thing? Like that, they probably said it in a very abrupt way, but it's like trying to explain the conflict between it is quite difficult. It's not just to kids, but I find it really difficult to explain as well, even to my friends. Like I'm still a bit not confused, just a bit. I'm trying to be more informed, if that's the that's how I feel. But I mean,
can I say one thing about the genocide thing? Kind of jump in there. I mean, obviously, when people think about genocide, if they think about it at all, people often think about the Second World War, the Holocaust, mass extermination of Jews, Roma people, gay people, which happened. It's real. It killed insane numbers of people. Obviously, there's been other genocides. Rwanda in the 1990s. There's been a genocide in the Congo in the last 30 years in Africa. There have been tragically too many genocides in the 20th and 21st centuries. That is a sad reality. What's happening in Israel and Palestine now, a lot of people, putting aside what's happened in the last 3 weeks, have called it a slow-moving genocide. And what that has, I think, meant is that Israel has not killed millions of Palestinians in the last few weeks, no, but what has been happening for decades is a growing and ever-increasing taking Palestinian land, taking their resources, taking their ability to work, controlling their ability to move from point A to point B, building a massive concrete wall that literally goes through Palestinian villages. I think a lot of people maybe are shocked that in the 21st century there's still something called colonialism, imperialism. It exists. Yeah. People often think about that, that happened years ago. The British did that. And yes, the British definitely did that, including to here. Yeah. But there is still a modern form of colonialism and imperialism. And the US has done that in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. I mean, this is sadly an idea that is alive and well in too many centres. And sadly, even in the last 3 weeks, you have seen, including in Australia, 100% of Western nations, 100% backing everything Israel is doing.
That's right.
Despite the fact that you have now probably 8,000 to 10,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza, the vast majority of whom are civilians, thousands of children, as if somehow bombing Gaza indiscriminately will not cause huge amounts of global reaction. I mean, just finally, people often think about 9/11, which was a horrific event that obviously led the US and the West to undertake 20 plus years of invasions and occupations and torture. Those conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan bled around the world, meaning that it led to violence elsewhere. Bombings in Europe, attacks here in Australia. Well, none of it justified terrorism, of course, but it explains it. It gives context. And what's happening now in Palestine, I fear, is going to bleed out from there. What happens in Palestine does not stay there. Yeah. Like what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq did not stay there in the last 20 years. And I fear what's happening now will be the same thing.
I think what I've seen on a lot of my platforms and what I see people voicing is the distress of the disproportionate reaction to absolutely what we condemn as to what Hamas did, and the brutality of that attack, but then seeing the reaction and the disproportionate reaction to the Palestinian people. Do you think it's been taken as an opportunity for the Israeli government and sort of the Western world to capitalise on more occupation, more, I suppose, of what they've been doing as a slow burn, but as a large attack that can sort of speed that process up of what they really want?
The short answer is yes, but let me briefly explain more. I think what you're seeing here is, for decades and decades, in so many Western countries, Palestinians are not viewed as equal citizens. Now, what I mean by that is, putting aside Palestinians who live in Australia, the US, Europe, there is a real sense that for many people in the West, in the media, in our profession and in the governments, regardless of who's in power, by the way, this doesn't make much of a difference.
Yeah.
Whether it's Donald Trump in the White House or Biden, whether it's Scott Morrison here or Albanese, there are differences. I'm not suggesting on other issues there are not differences. Of course there are. Morrison's not Albanese. I get that, obviously. But on certain kinds of issues, on foreign policy, there's actually not that much difference between Labor and Liberal here. Not much at all. On AUKUS, on the US alliance, on supporting Israel uncritically. Do you think Scott Morrison would have been that different? There would have been no difference. Mm-mm. This, I think, is something people need to understand. Domestically, for sure, Labor and Liberal are different. No denying that. But when it comes to international affairs, they're remarkably similar. And I think there is a real sense here that the fear that many of us have is that what Israel is trying to do here is to continue what they claim was unfinished business. Israel was founded in 1948, undeniably in the ashes of the Holocaust. And when Israel was founded, there was mass ethnic cleansing of roughly 750,000 Palestinians who were forcibly kicked out and moved to neighbouring states.
Yes.
Fast forward 75 years, and you have literally Israeli government ministers, media figures in Israel openly saying we have to finish the job we did not finish in 1948. In other words, we started ethnic cleansing then, we have not finished it. People can Google those comments, they're not secret, they're online, they're easy to find. It's said in the last 3 weeks, let alone the last years. And the fear is that Israel will take this opportunity to try at least to push out the roughly 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza and try to kick them out to, say, Egypt, which is a neighbouring country. Now, Egypt has currently refused to do that. It's obviously an ongoing situation. But the idea that, and I have a lot of friends in Gaza, I've got friends in Israel too, I've got friends in Gaza who fear this, who fear that all of Gaza is a war zone. When Israel in the West says they should go somewhere safe, where? The borders are shut.
Exactly.
There is nowhere to go at all. And I think what is happening now, and this is what I talk about in my new book, The Palestine Laboratory, which essentially talks about how Israel tests and trials huge amounts of repressive technology on Palestinians in Palestine. And then they export that to the world, claiming that it's so-called battle-tested. In other words, they show videos and footage. So you have literally well over 100 nations around the world, most nations on the planet, that have been buying a form of this technology. So I'm talking about spyware, spying on people's phones, drones, like repressive, horrible technology. And even in the last 2 weeks, finally, I've seen Israel, inverted commas, demonstrating new weapons on Gaza, which I guarantee you, having researched this, they will then sell this in years to come as battle-tested on Palestine.
Yeah.
And I think more and more people are kind of waking up to this, that we have a situation where, as horrible as it is in Palestine for Palestinians, this situation does not stay there. The occupation is exported globally at a time where a lot of people, I fear, especially on the global right, look to Israel actually as a model, not as something to be critical of, but to look to Israel and they say, we want to create in our own country, US, parts of Europe, elsewhere, Australia, an ethno-nationalist Christian state. Now, obviously, Israel is a Jewish state, but you have a lot of people on the global far right. If you go to far right rallies, which I sometimes go to be clear, for work, not for pleasure, you often see an Israeli flag at these rallies.
Yeah.
This is far right Nazis holding a Jewish Israeli flag. Why are they doing that? Because they support what Israel is doing to Palestinians. They want to create something similar in Australia or the US or elsewhere. And that to me should be a warning for all of us that what happens in Palestine, Israel, is not staying there.
Mm-hmm. I think what is really refreshing is hearing your view on this and hearing your take. I think that across the board, the media hasn't been balanced, and the global press.
Yeah.
What is your view on that? Do you see that there is favour with the press?
You know, I've spent too much time in the last 20 years being critical of my glorious own profession in the media. I do look. There's good journalists doing good work. I don't want to say every journalist, because of course that's untrue. There's good journalists in outlets in Australia, the US, Europe, and even in Israel and Palestine. And particularly, let's not forget, in the last 3 weeks, at least 29 Palestinian journalists have been killed by Israel. These are just journalists who are trying to do their job in unbelievably impossible, difficult situations. Some listeners may have seen a few days ago a leading Al Jazeera, major media outlet correspondent in Gaza. He was told live on air that his wife and kids had been killed, live on air. And he was shown going to the hospital to see, I think it was his son. I mean, just unimaginable horrors. But one of the things I think when it comes to media coverage is, and again, it's hard not to generalize because there's always exceptions, is that I think for too long I've called it that much of the media is run like a protection racket for Israel. There's a lot of, I think, sympathy in a lot of the media for Israel, and that happens partly because, many listeners don't know this, every year, although it was a short break during COVID, of course, when our borders were shut, every year the Israel lobby, Advocates for Israel, take huge numbers of journalists and politicians to Israel on propaganda trips. Mm-hmm. It's not a secret. People can read about this if they Google it. Labor and Liberal journalists from across the board, so-called conservative media and more so-called progressive media. Mm-hmm. Not every journalist does it, of course. Not every politician does it, but huge numbers do. Mm-hmm. And they come back sprouting propaganda, essentially. They set up unthinking lines. That, to me, is one factor.
Yeah.
And those trips also happen, by the way, to the US and Taiwan. It doesn't just happen to Israel in terms of different issues, US alliance, potential war with China and Taiwan.
Yes.
So it happens there too. And I think for a lot of journalists, there's a real, I don't know if it's reluctance or hesitation because of the history of the Jewish people, because of the Holocaust, to sort of really call it how it is, that, of course, Jews have the right to live in safety and security. Everyone does. Every human being does. But I think some people can't get their head around, or frankly don't have a problem with, the idea that there is something called Jewish-led colonization. It's happening. This is what Palestine is. It doesn't mean every Jew supports, doesn't mean every Israeli supports it. They don't. But sadly, after 75 years of this horrific situation, the facts speak for themselves. Yeah. And to me, I think it's important that there is a sense, and this is why these conversations are so important, that people realize that not every Jewish person supports what's happening over there. They do not. The loudest Jewish voices do. Uncritical support for Israel, which is so destructive, because I worry about, there is a rise in anti-Semitism. There's a rise of, and there's a rise of anti-Muslims, and there's a rise, anti-black racism. And, there's a rise in racism in general. It's not just directed at Jews, of course. And I care about all of that. But I worry that by a Jewish community which is too uncritical towards a state that colonizes another people, anti-Semitism is undeniably rising because people do not separate between Judaism and Zionism. Zionism is the ideology of believing Jews have the right to a state. Judaism is a religion. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm Jewish, personally, although as I said, not religious, but I'm anti-Zionist. I think that by definition, any religious state, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, discriminates against people. I mean, India is becoming a Hindu fundamentalist state under Prime Minister Modi. It discriminates against Muslims. Mm-hmm. Often Muslim states discriminate against non-Muslims. If there's a Christian fundamentalist state, which I fear where the US is going, who do you think will suffer? Not Christians. Yeah. So this, to me, I fear is the legacy of the Jewish people 75, 80 years after the Holocaust, is a state that is known globally, increasingly, Israel, as an occupying nation. That, to me, is shameful.
Yeah. I know that there's a massive call for the UN to step in here. And you've seen the most recent, I suppose, vote that happened, and Australia abstained, which is,
very brave of us as usual. On the fence.
Absolutely.
Well, that's what, and I think that's what kind of it feels and reads, doesn't it?
It feels like we really just don't have a backbone,
and
we're too afraid to go up against those leaders who are supposedly our biggest allies. It's and I believe that the global community is wanting the UN to step in. What exactly can the UN do in a moment like this?
Great
well,
question.
A ceasefire would be the beginning. I mean, as you say, Australia's role, I've said for years, Australia doesn't have an independent foreign policy. We are a client state of the US. So whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan years ago, whether it's Israel, Palestine now, whether there's this insane AUKUS deal of buying ridiculously expensive submarines that are never going to happen anyway, we don't have an independent foreign policy. So when this kind of thing happens, I said before, whether it's Albanese in, say, the White House, well, he was in the White House last week, whether he's in the Lodge or whether it's Scott Morrison, it doesn't make a difference. This is bipartisanship. Really. Yes. The Greens, to their credit, I'm not a member of any political party to be clear, but the Greens have been more critical of what's happening than the other parties have. I mean, the ceasefire is the beginning. A ceasefire doesn't solve every problem, but it stops the violence. Let's not forget, there are hundreds and hundreds, we don't know the exact number, about 230 hostages that Hamas is holding in Gaza. They have to be released. It's absolutely outrageous that they're being held, women and children included. But there are also, which is what Hamas claims why they took the hostages, thousands and thousands of Palestinian prisoners in Israel, many of whom are there without charge. There's something called administrative detention in Israel and Palestine, where Israel claims the right to hold people without charge for literally years.
Wow.
Secret evidence. People can Google this, not a secret. I mean, a lot of Israeli human rights groups have been saying this for years. And it's important, I think, people understand that the wider context here is Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, parts of the UN. So the leading human rights groups in the world in the last years have all come out and said what Israel is doing is committing apartheid. The word that we hear about when we think of South Africa.
That's right.
Which undeniably was apartheid back in the day, which is now ended. In 1994. I mean, South Africa is a deeply problematic society these days, but officially apartheid is over. But what's happening in Palestine is apartheid now. So the idea of going back to the status quo, even with the ceasefire, is not going to, frankly, in my view, be acceptable to anyone, particularly in Palestine. There needs to be a ceasefire for one. Obviously, the hostages have to be released by Hamas for sure, and huge numbers of Palestinians who are in prison, including, I might add, children. There are huge numbers of Palestinian children imprisoned. And I mean, it's why when you guys started off talking about how for some First Nations people they see parallels. What's happening here is not the same as Palestine. It's always different. It's not exactly the same. But there are deep parallels. And there are parallels because for a lot of settler colonial societies, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, there's a reason why all those states support Israel uncritically. They might not necessarily I don't think Albanese is consciously thinking to himself, I'm a settler colonial leader, I'm going to support a fellow. I don't think he thinks of it like that necessarily, but that's the reality. And it's not surprising that all these states that are settler colonial backgrounds or presence are supporting Israel. And it's why much of the global south, which has fought for decades against that, South America, parts of Africa and elsewhere, do not see it in the same way. See what is happening as colonialism. So, yes, a ceasefire must happen immediately. I fear that it won't in the short term, but the pressure has to be applied to our politicians, to Albanese, to Penny Wong, our foreign minister. And I think also to raise our voices that the public is saying that the current situation is not acceptable. Condemn Hamas by all means. Keep on condemning them. I mean, the idea of Hamas, and I've spent time in Gaza as a journalist. I mean, I've been there over the years many times. I spent time with Hamas as a reporter. They were friendly enough to me, but there's and it's important. Not every Hamas member is a killer. I mean, it's important to understand that. It's not to defend Hamas by any means, but Hamas is sort of a political organization, but also a provider of social services. So just imagine that there's a military wing that obviously committed hideous acts 3 weeks ago, but also they're providing schools and healthcare as well. not all those guys are terrorists. They're just not. But they're the ones who are being killed at the moment. And you are breeding this generational struggle, which is going to cause so much more violence and hatred. It's against everyone, against Israeli Jews for sure, against Jews in general, and against the global community, because terrorism undeniably will rise because of this all over the world. I mean, you can write the script for this now. Yeah. After 9/11, exactly the same thing. You could tell that was going to happen after an invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan that was such a disaster. Global terrorism spiked, right? That's going to similar things going to happen here, I fear.
I think the main I suppose reason for this attack is to wipe out Hamas, right? And to, I suppose, seek revenge on what has happened. There has to be a better way forward if that is their objective. In your opinion, this is, different to what happened in Afghanistan. It's quite different. Is there another way, if that is their objective, to be able to achieve, eliminating Hamas?
I fear that what Israel's doing in Gaza is exactly not learning the lessons of the US and Iraq and Afghanistan, because we shouldn't forget the US overthrew the Taliban in 3 weeks in 2001. They overthrew Saddam in 2-3 weeks in 2003. However, right, that wasn't the problem. That wasn't the hard bit. What came was the guerrilla insurgency that lasted 20 years that caused carnage for Afghans, for Iraqis, for American soldiers, of course. And the Taliban now are back in charge in Afghanistan. And I've spent time there as a journalist, not since the takeover, but I've been there in the last 10, 15 years. And I think there's no doubt that Israel's aim is to eliminate Hamas, and it's potentially possible militarily you can do that maybe, but at what expense?
Yeah.
Leveling Gaza. And then what has been so infuriating to me is, what is the plan after that? Yeah. What will happen to the 2.3 million Palestinians who've already been suffering, by the way, under a nearly 20-year siege, where people aren't unaware of this, but not a lot of goods come into Gaza. Putting aside what happened 3 weeks ago, Egypt and Israel have been imposing a brutal siege for years. Palestinians often can't get out, can't study abroad, can't get the medical care they need beyond, because the services in Gaza are very poor. So you have huge amounts of Palestinians who are suffering, for example, from health problems that they wouldn't normally die from, breast cancer in women, various other horrible diseases. And there has to be another way. The other way to me is a negotiated settlement. That's the only way. I mean, eventually, and this is, the US spoke to the Taliban in Afghanistan. You don't have to like them. I don't like them. They're often a bunch of brutal thugs. But eventually, you got to talk. You have to talk. And it seems so strange in the 21st century that saying you should talk is seen as radical or controversial, as if somehow the first response is overwhelming military force. Yeah. And I think eventually, I've said this for years, Israel and Palestine cannot resolve this on their own. It's not going to happen for a range of reasons, historical reasons, current hatreds. They can't. You need a third party or a fourth party. The US, to me, is the wrong option too, because the US, as an Israel advocate said years ago, their role has been, they've been Israel's lawyer for decades, essentially. So the UN, in theory, is that the UN, as listeners will be aware, is also a deeply broken organization. I mean, look at so many conflicts. The UN is unwilling, unable to resolve them. Russia-Ukraine is still going on. We don't read about them now, but Russia invaded Ukraine a year and a half ago, and that conflict is not over. In fact, it's escalating. Yeah. But the UN, to me, is a valuable body, despite all the problems that it exists, that need to get involved here. Is it involved some kind of peacekeeping? Ideally not. I think Hamas rule in Gaza does not have a future. I don't say that in terms of what I think should happen, but I do not think that Israel will accept that, regardless of negotiation. I just don't think they will anymore. And after October 7, to some extent, I understand that. But as I said, eliminating them will not solve the problem until all Palestinians, West Bank, Gaza, everywhere, are given equal rights, which has not been the case in entirely Israel's existence. This will not end. It seems so crazy that even today, it's controversial to say all Palestinians should have equal rights in Palestine, meaning they should be able to vote equally, get equal rights, have same access to healthcare, schooling. That currently does not exist. Palestinians are treated as second-class citizens. And as someone who's Jewish, And for listeners who aren't aware, I could go to Israel tomorrow and become an Israeli citizen within a few months. If I can prove that I am Jewish, which I could be a citizen. And I've always refused that on political reasons. I thought it was deeply racist and inappropriate when Palestinians, who have, frankly, far more connection to the land than me, don't have that same right.
Yeah. Where do we go from here?
Yeah.
Like, as people who are sitting in Australia, and yes, this country isn't perfect, but we are a long way from on-ground conflict and children being bombed and hospitals being, bombed. I feel like we have a level of responsibility with what we have, especially in the Western world, to show a different opinion, to stand in solidarity. Where is it that we go? What is it that we can do?
I mean, I think, as I said, Australia, and this is not just relevant for Palestine, but lots of other issues in terms of our foreign policy, we need to really create an independent foreign policy. It doesn't mean we never support a Western state or a Western idea. It just means that we actually have our own ideas. We are literally a carbon copy of whatever the White House says or wants. It doesn't matter if Biden's in there or Trump or someone else. And on this issue, Australia is not not one of the leading nations in the world size-wise. Of course we're not, but we can play a really important role. And acknowledging Palestinian suffering, calling for a ceasefire, things that should be utterly uncontroversial are not. And I noted in the last few weeks, a lot of areas of, say, Western Sydney, as one example, traditionally have been very big supporters of Labor. I don't live in Western Sydney myself, but traditionally a lot of Muslims and Arab people. And a lot of them are saying, and it's early days, that we will campaign against Labor at the next election because of what you've done. Now, I'm not a member of any party, so this is not, I don't have a dog in the fight, so to speak. But this will be the impact. That if you are seen as a political party, Labor is in power now, although, as I said, it would be no different if we had Liberals in power, frankly, on this issue. That there is a belief that Australia should play a more constructive role, a role that says that Palestinians do deserve equal rights. They do deserve, for example, their own state. It should not be controversial to say that. And yet, seemingly, it still is. And I think also a sort of an acknowledgement of what you guys were saying at the beginning, and I'm hearing from other people. I was at a rally yesterday in support of Palestine. There were large numbers of First Nations people there who were saying, we do see a comparison. We do feel that there is not exactly the same, of course, but we do see a comparison between how Palestinians are treated in Israel and Palestine and how we've been treated in Australia for, 230 odd years. I mean, there are comparisons. Deep comparisons. And as I said before, when I was in New Zealand, the Maori people there said very similar things about their own experience. So a lot of it to me is acknowledging the other side's humanity, but not accepting that Israel has a right to occupy another people forever, because that's the right they currently believe that they have, because they're given Western indulgence to do so. And having spent time there for years, reported from there, having friends, I've got no direct family there, but I've been reporting from there to Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, amongst a lot of other places in the world. And what infuriates me so much is that Israel claims to speak in my name. It claims to speak. It is a Jewish state. It discriminates against anyone who is not Jewish, and therefore says, as Netanyahu, who's the Prime Minister, I am the leader of the global Jewish community. It's just nonsense, apart from the fact that he's just a racist and a bigot. But putting that issue aside, this idea somehow that a state that discriminates is something that we should be proud of as Jews is absurd. And there are more and more. I mean, to sort of have a mildly positive note, when I started writing about this 20 years ago, there weren't that many prominent Jewish voices saying this. I wasn't the only one, but there weren't huge numbers. That is now changing. And in Australia, and there were a lot of Jewish people at the pro-Palestine rally yesterday. Just in the last few days, some people may have seen online, there were hundreds and hundreds of Jews at Grand Central Station in New York demanding a ceasefire. Last week, there were 500 Jews in Congress in the US, including rabbis, demanding a ceasefire. Now, they're a minority of Jews. I acknowledge that. But it's a growing amount of people who say, not in my name. Do not, as a Jewish person, think that because we're Jewish, therefore automatically we support what Israel says or does. We do not. And yes, loud Jewish spokespeople claim that all the Jewish community is in unison. It's not true. They're not. So I think it's partly the media, frankly, acknowledging that there is a diversity of opinion. It's like in any community. It's obvious to say that.
We
of course, like it's like, saying First Nations people have one voice. Of course they don't. Obviously, you guys would know that. Yes, the recent referendum revealed that, sadly, in many disturbing ways. But, there's diversity of opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
that's
I think the media needs to do a better job about that, to recognise that.
Well, that's when you started talking about, different opinions and voices, I was thinking, wow, okay, well, we just recently had that in the referendum. Like that felt like, the louder voices,
the extremists,
were the ones that we didn't connect with and didn't, didn't resonate with what they were saying. So we feel you on that way. Obviously, we're not the extremities of this conflict, but I feel you in that sense.
We so appreciate your time today, Antony, and there's so much.
It's been great.
It's a wealth of knowledge and wisdom that you have on this particular topic. Where can our listeners find your book if they'd like to do a deeper dive?
Yeah, so they can go to my website, it's just myname.com, antonylowenstein.com. My new book, The Palestine Laboratory, which came out a few months ago, which I'm told is just sort of suddenly blown up for ways that make me feel a bit uncomfortable, as you can probably imagine. But they can find that online. It's available at all good bookshops. The publisher is Scribe. It should be available everywhere. People can find a copy. It's easy to get.
Yeah, so, we'll put a link in our show notes for you and for our listeners to listen or to head to. I definitely will be doing some more research and some interest in that. So thank you so much for coming on today and allowing us this time, your voice and your
leadership. I
leadership.
really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you
guys.
so much. Oh my God, what an episode.
Yeah, I feel much more informed. I feel like I have more to say, to be honest. I feel like I have more to do and support and make sure that I'm using my platform and just making sure that we have our voices and we have our platforms, and if we can help share content. And the other day I shared a list of the journalists who were in Gaza. Unfortunately, some of them had passed away. Even Antony had mentioned that. Yeah. But your little things like that, where people can follow along and donate and hopefully support the cause, because as a First Nations person,
there are some parallels.
There are parallels, and I want to be an ally to all communities.
100%.
I don't want to just expect people to be an ally to mine and not show up for them. So I feel more informed. I feel like I have more to say, and I feel like there's definitely going to be some more, stuff that I can do to support the people who are affected.
I think what I took from that, and I'm only going to have two points because otherwise I'll be here for another episode, was that, we are leaders in our community and we try to be, we try to lead with humanity and being good people and doing the right thing and using our voice. And I think, this episode for me it was, as much as it was informative for us and myself, it's hopefully, that's, Antony's taught you guys a little bit more as well. And I think, the core of it is that the devastation and what's happening shouldn't be happening. Yes. And we can take part in trying to help. And I think the other thing is that there are the parallels to our community, but doesn't mean that, we should be silenced as well. So. Yeah. But I think that's probably all we have time for today. And thank you so much for listening to Not So PG. If you love us, leave a 5-star rating and a little review.
And if you want to tell us something, follow us on social media or slide into the DMs. Brooke's handle is @Brooke.Lurton. Mine is @It's Maddie Mills. And you can follow all the Nova Podcast action over at Nova Podcast Official. All right, Emo. Bye.
Bye.